What's going on, everyone? I am very excited because set 4 is just over a week away and we're about to see a massive influx of meta changes. And I wanted to talk about a few cards that, well, are cards you might want to take a look out for, or at least be on the lookout for. Some of these are cards that, well, you've seen kind of a lot with set 3 or even just prior before that. And some of these cards are cards that are sitting in sideboards right now. And some of these are cards maybe people haven't necessarily considered, but maybe have some powerful synergies, or cards that, well, I've seen do some pretty nice work. So a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. And also I have a TCG player link in the description down below. And let's dive into our first one for today. And our first one starts off with Aggression, which is not a card that people think is underpowered by any means. It is a very, very strong card, but with set 4, this is one of those cards where it actually might push you towards double red more so than any time before, which is part of the reason why people are playing double blue. It's for vigilance. It's kind of similar with Aggression. Now, not every deck's going to be a pilot deck. Not every deck's just going to be going all in. If you do happen to be fighting a deck that is a pilot deck, Aggression is just disgusting. Remember, you could choose these in any order, which means defeating those upgrades can come before dealing 4 damage or vice versa. It's just a really, really amazing card to get something like an Open Fire and be able to go ahead and have potentially double confiscate on that event, all for 4 resources. Now, of course, it is double Aggression, which is the reason why we haven't seen Aggression all that much. Vigilance is one of the few cards where we're playing out of aspect quite frequently for 6, but you don't really see that with a lot of others. Double Cunning is just fits with the decks a little bit better, but double red isn't something that we've seen a whole lot. There are a few decks that kind of support this a little bit better with set 4, especially with more cards in the pool and more Aggression cards that make it easier to run Aggression as the double red card here in your deck. So if you are ending up in a situation where you see a lot of upgrades out there, this thing takes out Chewbacca's, which can be an absolute nightmare. It takes out random upgrades like just a Podamaran or something like a Biggs going on a unit. But then also, and this does happen a lot, especially with a few decks, it can take out some leaders that are pilots. And that can be exceptionally powerful as a kind of just a side action. You're dealing 4 to a unit, probably taking it out, and then suddenly you get to kill their leader and maybe defeat another upgrade. This is pretty good of a card. And if you are more of an aggressive deck, you absolutely could go something like defeat a couple upgrades and ready up a unit to keep pushing in damage. It works particularly well with cards like the A-Wing and the Y-Wing, where you're able to get some extra value. Even though it has low power, it does really well for itself. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if I saw some people dropping this in their sideboard for 6 resources, because there are a lot of leaders that are pilots that come down on 6 that, well, or 5 rather, both in this case, that can really get messed up by an Aggression. Maybe this is one of those cards that people just forget about, or maybe they just don't know that you could play this in any deck anywhere, but this, as long as you're cunning, this Bamboozle is incredible. There's a lot of more aggressively focused decks. Things like Kazuda, things like Major Von Reg, obviously are new 4-drop leaders, but also this is a card where I have slotted this in Double Yellow Han, or even some decks from set 3 or even earlier than that. And again, you don't need to be playing double yellow. Obviously, you need a good portion of cunning cards to get this value, but you also don't need to be heroism at all. This could be played in villainy decks, which I'm a little bit surprised as to not see this more often. This is something that I've slotted into a lot of my villainy decks just as a side option, especially in the sideboard, because one of the big things about a lot of decks is your cards in hand aren't really something that's a limiting factor. I'll actually say with Double Yellow Han, it is one of the decks that has cards in hand as a limiting factor because of your action, but a lot of other decks don't have that same limitation. If you're playing Sabine Yellow, one of the big things is you do want to be able to deploy your entire hand early on in the game, and sometimes Bamboozle can help you do that by getting you a ton of value by playing a free event. Of course, exhausting a unit can be potentially extremely powerful, but pulling off upgrades is also extremely powerful with the new set. Millennium Falcons are kind of all over the place. They're one of the best things to go ahead and take out, making sure that it can't just be immediately readied up or immediately put a Han Solo on and completely wreck your Space Force. But also, like, the bigger Millennium Falcon that gets bigger with all the pilots, that thing can just, in some cases, take a little bit of damage, and then you bamboozle it. You maybe return their upgrades, but it actually kills off the unit because it already had some damage on it, which is one of the biggest things about bamboozle. Is it's actually sometimes a surprise kill of a unit because it just got a little bit of damage on it. But extremely free or extremely powerful while being free in certain matchups gives us a shot in basically any cunning deck. And I always come back to cards like this that have an alternate cost. And think about it, because any card that can be played for free by using some other resource instead of your actual resources, allowing you to split between the cards in your hand that cost resources and, well, using alternate resources, you could potentially build an insanely powerful deck and really surprise your opponent with something like Bamboozle. This next one is one that I have really been messing around with, and I've really been excited about him. 2-cost ground unit Lux Bonteri. This is one that a lot of you probably don't even know because you don't really see it at all. But anytime an opponent plays a card, if that opponent paid less than the card's cost to play it, you may ready or exhaust a unit. This is something I've been slotting in. I've recently tried it in like Double Yellow Kaz. I've tried it in a couple other more aggressive decks. Because one of the big things is you get to choose to ready or exhaust a unit. Obviously, in the more controlling, or even maybe not necessarily controlling, but just decks that are looking to curve out, maybe get to the middle portion of the game, exhausting can be extremely powerful on your opponent's units. And readying up can give you a little bit of value. But I've noticed it to be the most powerful in the more aggressive decks. And particularly, the reason why we're mentioning this card is anytime your opponent's going to be piloting, those cards are going to be paid less than the card's cost. Almost in every situation. I'm trying to think of a pilot card that costs more than the card's printed cost. And I think the only one would be like the Pantoran Starship Thief, I think is the only one. But anytime your opponent plays a Biggs or a Chewbacca, which again are very, very common cards, especially Chewbacca in a lot of decks, that's something I've been seeing in like just Sabine Green, for example. Decks that aren't necessarily pilot decks, just decks that are utilizing the pilot mechanic. Suddenly, if you're turn one, you play a Lux, and then they play a unit, you take initiative, you just attack with Lux immediately, and they want to pilot something out. Now they have to be worried that you're going to get in another 3 points of damage because you can go ahead and ready a unit. Or if you are trying to race them and maybe it's more worthwhile to exhaust, if they try to play a pilot and then get in an attack, maybe exhausting their unit is more impactful. Again, not a card that's going to be like game breaking in every matchup, but against those pilot matchups, especially when you are able to leverage the additional cost of their card versus their pilot cost, this Lux, just Lux on the board himself, I've seen get in multiple hits in a single turn. Again, anytime an opponent pays less than the card's cost, you can ready or exhaust the unit, which means you can ready Lux multiple times in a round. Just with him on the board, I've gotten in 6 to 9 damage in a single turn, because of all the pilots, which can add up massively, right? 2-3 swings in a single turn can be a third of an opponent's HP, which is incredible. These last two are pretty similar in style. The first one being Bright Hope. We've got a 4-cost command heroism unit that I'm sure a lot of you already know what it does, as you've probably seen it all over the place. But a 2/6 in space is actually a pretty nice body when you tag along Sentinel. And one of the big things about Bright Hope is you are in the perfect aspect combination to make it kind of unkillable, insurmountable, I should say, space unit with Chewbacca. Bright Hope comes down, it's a 2/6, it's already obnoxious to deal with, especially if your opponent's going into the space. You put a Chewbacca on it, it's a 5/9 Sentinel, and it can't be bounced. It can't go ahead and just be defeated by some random, Velvet Dragon, for example. So now your opponent's gotta fight through the Bright Hope, and it's probably taking out their entire space force on their opponent's side of the battlefield. But you also don't just need the Chewbacca. Just fitting up any Sentinel with a little bit of extra power and toughness can be really devastating for your opponent. Just putting like a Biggs on this, for example, turns it into a 4/4 because it's a transport, it gives it a 4/8 rather, +2/2 because it's a transport. So 4/8 is significantly stronger than a 2/6. Most units on the 1/2 turns of the game in space are going to at most have 4 toughness. So now your Bright Hope is actually killing off the units whenever the opponents are attacking into the Bright Hope. This is something that I've just kind of slotted in a lot of my decks, and not only is it really good at just blocking your opponent from attacking your base if you're trying to play a more defensive deck, but I played it in like Wedge, for example, and I'm going in aggressively with my earlier units, and then I get down a Bright Hope, and then I just drop a, Biggs on this, and I am now protecting my own space units from their space units, and that can be really powerful as well. Just, again, providing a little bit of disruption, a little bit of interaction, but in a way that controls your own deck versus your opponent's, because of the Sentinel aspect. And a very similar thing for our last one on the list. Both of these, unlike the other three, are probably seen the most. Concord on Interceptors, as well as your Bright Hopes. Bright Hope was a pretty good card with set 3, and I think it's going to get even better depending on, of course, how proliferate the pilots are in the meta. The more those are, the more likely Space Sentinels are going to get even better. However, Concord on Interceptors just has been an amazing unit overall because it fits perfectly on the curve for when Sentinels really can be obnoxious. And more importantly, it's got that 3 power while it's defending. It's super cheap. It just does kind of everything that you're looking for. And we saw this, again, quite a few times in set 3. It was a pretty big staple in terms of Anakin Blue, Rey Red, those types of decks. But most of the time, it was like a 1 to 2 copies of, maybe more in the sideboard. This can absolutely have potential to be a full 3 of main deck. Not a very impressive card at face value. These are a little bit more unassuming, but the power of a Sentinel can be absolutely incredible when it comes to your opponent really just trying to get in a ton of damage and go into the space arena. With a lot more space units in set 4, one of the big things is going more towards space or potentially playing multiple 2-resource plays that are in space alongside your most powerful ground units just makes a lot more sense. People are really indexing towards more of both versus one field just because the card quality of a certain space unit is more so than a ground unit and vice versa in some situations. And so we're seeing a lot just more units being played that are higher quality. And a lot of those tend to be space units because set 4 is more indexing towards space units, which means a turn 2 Sentinel that can absolutely block basically any turn 1 space unit play, assuming they don't upgrade it. And in some cases they will with a pilot. But then it comes back to you and maybe you're able to upgrade the Concord on Interceptors, right? You can play this not necessarily on turn 2, but even a little bit later, upgrade it with one of your pilots, and suddenly you have the same situation that Bright Hope has going on. There's even a little bit of healing. Maybe you Rose Tico fans have finally found a card for you. Not that I think that's all that relevant. I just think the Sentinel itself has been such a deterrent in a lot of situations that I've been really impressed with Concord on Interceptors. And it even works in more, not necessarily super aggressive decks, but decks that are looking to get to the 5, 6, 7 resources, such as Luke Blue, where you get a Sentinel, you get a fighter, you get something in space where you're able to go out and get in an attack, still use Luke's ability, but then you also get to stall out the game to where you can deploy Luke and still get value from him and really dominate the game. Little bit of versatility with Concord on Interceptors, which I absolutely love. But that's going to wrap up our list today. I'm sure there's a lot more cards out there that people are like, well, have you checked out this one? And of course, I could sit here talking about Triple Dark Raid, or I could sit here talking about, whatever card that's already disgusting and is just like obviously disgusting. But these were some cards where I hadn't really seen a whole lot of people index towards maybe because they're experimenting more with set 4 and they're not really looking for things to beat set 4 or cards that will get better with set 4, just testing out set 4 in general. But there are a few gems. I think one of the most fun ones out of the ones I went over today is that Lux Bonteri. It is incredible to see just a card really just do some massive work as a 2-drop, right? There's really little downside to be putting a 2-resource 3/2 that has potentially a really powerful ability in your deck. And if you are playing a more aggressive deck like Kazuda, I've been indexing this in my sideboarding plan, which is pretty nice, especially when you are fighting those pilot decks, because one of the things that the pilot decks usually lack is the ability to interact with ground units. And if suddenly their strategy is enabling 3 to 6 to 9 additional damage, and remember, that could be removing their damage or increasing another unit or readying up another unit, that could be pretty fun. So definitely give some of these a try. I think you'll have some fun with playing with them, and I think they're going to be a little bit better in set 4 because of what we're expecting with the pilots and all sorts of mechanics with that. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed, and I'll see you all for the next one.